Welcome back, friends. In our last episode, you watched a brief introduction on metaphysical poets. Continuing the thread, today we discuss metaphysical poets with a few observations on their poetry, their technique and the other elements present in their poetry. I have with me Prakash. Welcome back, Prakash. Prakash, can you quickly give us the elements which one could find in metaphysical poetry?
Like for example, in the last episode we pointed out that hyperbole, paradox, conceit and a certain use of metaphor and taking examples from scientific achievements or geographical discoveries. These are the popular or more well-known aspects of metaphysical poetry. And now we'll illustrate or show how we discover these elements in their poetry. And Sharda will be reading a poem of Donne and interpreting it to show our readers what metaphysical poetry is all about. This is a very popular poem by John Donne, who is this great metaphysical poet, and it's called Death Be Not Proud. Please go ahead.
Prakash, actually Death Be Not Proud has been prescribed at all levels for students, not only in India but also in many universities or many educational centers around the world. And this is a popular poem because it is easily understood, because it has a level of abstract element to it which even a commoner or a reader for the first time can actually associate with. One of my personal favorites, Death Be Not Proud, takes up a larger issue which is not only just death or associating with the grief which death brings with it, but it is a rebellion against death. Let me read the poem for you, friends. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure then from thee more must flow, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings and desperate men, and dost with poison, war and sickness dwell, and popular charms can make us sleep as well. And better than thy stroke, why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we awake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Now this is actually hitting at the eye of death, as I would put it. Here the poet actually takes death by its horns and he says, it is not just you who can decide the fate of emperors or slaves or people. It's just that the idea of death as an all-encompassing thing, something which happens to everyone, something which can destroy someone's existence, has been there, and people have had this little fear about death, death as the great leveler or death as something which is all the more powerful in itself. But here he says, he wonders why people are so engrossed with the very idea of death being so powerful and so mighty. He says it isn't so, it isn't that at all. He says one can have death as and when one wants it. He says charms can lead us to death, poppy can lead us to death, war can lead us to death, desperate people can kill each other. So he says death is not mighty or powerful in itself. There are many agents to death. So he has this wonderful take when he says that it is the person who gives more value to death rather than the very idea of death in its own. And he says death is just like a short sleep, you just rest for some time and you awake eternally. So he believes that death is just one agent which transfers you from this physical world and which moves you into another world, which could be heaven, based on one's doings or whatever the logic is here. But then interestingly he says death should not be something which could scare people or something which should worry people. He says death is welcome as much as that death is in people's hand. So death by chance or death by fate is totally ruled out by the poet, because he thinks that people are here to take death in their life as and when they want to, and death cannot be interfering as and when it wants to.
Because there are two things here, I mean, one is it opens with the paradox,
Yes.
death be not proud, and it closes with the paradox, death thou shalt die, right? And look, the association of pride, I mean, the fall of Adam in the Garden of Eden. And somehow the fall of Adam is the beginning of death for man or for mankind.
Mortality.
Mortality, as Dunn sees it. So, I mean, if you recollect in the previous episode, we spoke about spirituality having a material basis. So, somehow that is also reflected in these lines. But what does this paradox mean? Death thou shalt die. So, does a man die physically, or does he die spiritually, or because he dies physically, he lives spiritually? What is the point being made here?
The point is death is just an agent, another agent of change. Just like how you have infancy and childhood and sickness and old age, there is death.
So it's nothing to be afraid
It's
of.
nothing, it's just an organic phase in one's life. It happens in the natural routine of things of a human being.
Very true.
So he just tries to say that in killing someone or when death occurs, it is death for death itself. He has this twin takes on the same issue.
Right.
So every time a person dies, it is actually humiliating for death itself, and also death is weakened there because it depends on the human soul to make its presence available. So I think he tries to play on the idea that there is no life for death except for death for people.
Very true, very true.
And the other thing very interesting is the address, who's the person who's being talked to in the poem. It is directly death. Instead of writing to a lover or writing to a father or a sister, here I told you initially, it's like taking the issue at hand, beginning with it, ending with it. So there is no open ending here, as mentioned earlier. And also the very idea that you directly talk to the theme.
So something abstract like
Something
death is
abstract,
personified. Yeah.
Apostrophe,
Yeah.
a very wonderful usage of apostrophe.
Yeah.
And this particular trend had caught up later with many
Right.
poets. So this began with Donne, although he might not have initiated it, but then he made wonderful use of it, which is still being followed by many writers to say, and many poets as well. So I think apart from the literary merit of the poem per se, the metaphors and the apostrophic element,
They work very powerfully.
they work very powerfully, and there is a logic.
There is a
reason. There is a reason in the text. So it works. It blends in perfectly, and I think it's a fine-tuned piece of work we have here.
Because the logic element is important, you see. Because metaphysical poets, in some sense, they invented poetic logic. So somehow there is this heavy argument, which in the beginning may seem abstract, but at the end of the poem you realize it's perfectly logical.
There is a fascination
Yeah,
with
there is
reason.
a fascination with reason.
With reason which works on the mind and also appeals to the intellect.
Yeah, in that sense. So I'll just read this particular poem, La Corona, the crown. And I want to show how Donne, like he does in this poem, Death Be Not Proud, you see, makes an argument. Like I said earlier, spirituality defines the metaphysical poets in an important way, especially Christian mysticism and Christian spirituality, although they universalized it to a great extent. So like this is about the life of Christ. It says, "Deign at my hands this crown of prayer and praise, weaved in my lone devout melancholy. Thou which of good hast, yea, art treasury, all changing, unchanged, ancient of days. But do not with the vile crown of frail bays reward my muses' white sincerity." See the use of metaphors, white sincerity. So how sincere is sincere? You see this association of whiteness with sincerity or purity, some kind of purity. You see, he's saying that my intentions are pure, and I want to be rewarded for the purity of my intentions. But he uses the metaphor of whiteness and puts it along with sincerity. And then what he says, but what thy thorny crown gained, that give me. So what is he asking in return? He is not asking for wealth or fame or whatever, things of this world, He says the same suffering that you had, give me that suffering, A crown of glory which doth flower always. So there is this idea, like in the death poem, time and eternity are put together, right? So in that sense, life is temporary, therefore death should not be proud, because after life will come eternity or afterlife, when death does not matter. So in that sense, death is only a passage, or a short sleep from which you wake up to another world. So the end crown our works, but thou crownest our ends. For at our ends begins our endless rest. The first last end, now zealously possessed, with a strong sober thirst my soul attends. It is time that heart and voice be lifted high. Salvation to all that will is nigh. So salvation is there for everyone who wants it. But the point is with these poems is, the last line goes into the next line, into the first line of the next poem. You see? So the next poem begins in this manner. Salvation to all that will is nigh. You see how the use of the crown, the metaphor of the crown. So in some sense the poems, which are 7 in number, which is also a sacred number. So the 7 poems or 7 sonnets are fit together to make a crown. You see, again the use of an abstract spiritual kind of a thing to talk about a concrete reality. And how he plays on the word all. Here all means everything, but all with a capital A means God, or divinity, or everything else, or everything that, or something that runs the universe. Or whatever. That all, which always is all everywhere, which cannot sin, and yet all sins must bear, which cannot die, yet cannot choose but die. See the paradoxes. That Christ is God, but also he has a human form. He takes the form of a man. So in that sense, cannot die, but cannot choose but die. You see? So his death is a choice for Christ. Lo, faithful virgin, yields himself to lie in prison in thy womb. And though he here can take no sin, nor thou give, yet he will wear, taken from thence, flesh, which death's force may try. So Christ is God, you see, for done. But at the same time, by being born to the Virgin Mary, he assumes flesh, you see. He wears the form of a man. So flesh in some sense is a dress, like a clothing that he wears, to declare his humanity, like any man. Before by the spears time was created, thou wast in his mind, who is thy son and brother. See this use of time, Sharda, so because here he sees time as eternity. So he is addressing the Virgin Mary, and telling her, before by the spears the time was created, before time came into existence, you were in his mind. Who is that you? God, you see. That God kept you in his mind before time was there, you see. That someday at some point he is going to be born to you, Who is thy son and brother. So Christ is brother to the Virgin Mary by virtue of the fact that he is brother to all men and women. But at the same time he is son to her, because he is her offspring, he is born to her, Whom thou conceivest, conceived. So God who has conceived you, but you are conceiving him now at this point in time. Yea, thou art now thy maker's maker. See the use of exaggerations, see how he exaggerates. You are the creator of your creator. You are not just an ordinary person. You are not just creating another being. You are creating your creator himself. And thy father's mother. Your mother to God, who is a father to all. Thou hast light in dark and shuttest in little room, immensity cloistered in thy dear womb. So immensity, again the use of the word all, to mean to say that something which is everything and which is everywhere is hidden in thy dear womb. But anyway, my point is that, this is just an example. It goes on for 5 more poems, but we have to see that, the metaphysical poets were not just concentrating on spirituality. As in the case of Andrew Marvell, to His Koi Mistress, sometimes they are very humorous, very sexual, very kind of down to earth in that sense. So that is a poem I think we should...
Before we move to the next poem, I have an observation to make. Let us look at the character of the poem. It's essentially religious in nature, because it talks about an eminent character in history, which is Christ himself, right? And the process of his birth, his nativity, as you would put it. Along with that, there is another historical truth which runs parallelly to the text, and that is the constant struggle which was taking place at Britain, the gain of the church, and then let us look at the 2 wings of Christianity, the Catholic Church at one end and the Protestant rebels on the other hand, how there was a major tug of war, and they would outweigh each other at different moments across lot of situations.
Right.
So I think in a moment like that, this particular poem
Makes
holds
sense.
more water than any other poem, because this in a way shows his allegiance to the religion he believes in or he trusts, number
Absolutely
one.
right.
It also shows his allegiance.
So why don't we look at this poem, To His Koi Mistress, by Andrew Marvell, who is another great metaphysical poet, and this is a particularly popular poem, and where again we see this sense of time versus eternity. So he's writing this poem to this mistress who is very coy, and he keeps telling her that your coyness is going to cost us a lot of time, and I don't have that much time at my disposal. It's quite a funny, quite ironic, and quite a erotic poem in that sense. He's attempting to persuade the mistress, not to take too much time in deciding, that she should be more immediate and more forthcoming. Sharda, the very beginning of the poem is interesting. You see, it begins with this really humorous note, and you can see that the lover is desperate, and which is why he makes this exaggerated appeal to the beloved. Had we but world enough and time, this coyness lady were no crime. Suddenly time becomes the issue, but time not in a larger sense, it's actually time in an immediate sense. Like he wants to get it over with, but somehow the lady, because of her coyness, is delaying, She keeps pushing him away. She keeps saying no to him, But then he says, and he gives his reasons why he thinks this coyness is a problem. We would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day. He said, if we have so much time, we can do all of these things. We can pass the whole day, but we don't. You see, time is short. You see, the same theme we see in Death Be Not Proud. That the idea that life is short. You see, again a very metaphysical theme. You see? And again this use of an abstract quality like time. Just as death is an abstract quality, just as suffering is an abstract quality, so is time. Because how do we measure time except in terms of personal experience, right? So my understanding of childhood is my understanding of what happens at a certain point, or the events that define my childhood, or those days that define, what my feelings were. we cannot understand them in an abstract sense. We cannot understand time in itself. But that's what the metaphysical poets are trying to do. They take these abstract themes and they give them concrete shape by relating them to their experience of life. And then he says, thou by the Indian Ganges side shouldst rubies find. I by the tide of Humber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood mentioned in the Old Testament of the Bible. And you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews, which comes hundreds of years later. So he's saying, if we had time, we could do all of these things. You could take as much time as you wanted, to delay this process of lovemaking. But sadly, time is immediate. Time does not wait for me and you see. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow, and 100 years should go to praise thine eyes and on thy forehead gaze, 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest. An age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at lower rate. What does vegetable love mean? What is he trying to say? What is the whole point of my vegetable love should grow vaster than empires? Why does he use the phrase vegetable love? I mean, it's an abstract phrase, in some sense. Like, is he referring to nature? I mean, sometimes those metaphors are pretty complex, I mean, is he referring to nature, or is he referring to changing time or a changing world? I mean, you can give these different meanings, to it. Again, the use of eternity, deserts of vast eternity. This idea, you can get the image immediately. The moment you think of eternity, it's like a vast desert. Just imagine you're standing before a desert. So timelessness is something like that. It's like goes on and on. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. He says both of us are disappearing, with time. Neither will your beauty be forever, nor will my song be forever. Both are destined to perish. Thanks to time. Then worms shall try that long preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. So both of will disappear. You will disappear, your body will disappear, and even my desire for you is going to disappear. Both of them have a temporary quality. But you can see that while he seems to say these things, he is so persuasive. It's not something that he really believes in. I mean, if you really thought that everything had an end, you wouldn't be writing this poem. Obviously, he has his own personal reasons for making these kinds of appeals. Obviously, he has a personal interest in doing it. And then he says, the grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do their embrace.
That's a funny line.
That's a funny line, because he says we can meet in the grave, but that's not a nice place to meet, It's better we meet in life,
If I could interrupt you there, Prakash, again, a woman was enabled to take a certain time before she would say yes to a gentleman. So probably the lady was taking her time to respond to this person, but he was the one who seemed to be more in haste because he wanted it very quickly, probably because he wanted her to be with him, or probably he understood the relevance of the time left, that why not make the best of time when I have it, instead of wasting it in formal kind of getting to know each other or courtship. So it works at two levels.
Right. So it's some kind of a pose he kind of makes. He invents this pose, of someone who's desperate, someone who wants things to happen immediately. So in that sense, you can see that the humor is in this, that he's not really serious, that his whole understanding of time is just to make fun, just to be persuasive and seductive in some abstract way.
By using hyperboles to show her that we don't have the time.
Right.
Yield soon, so that we could use it properly to our end. Right. I think he was trying to do that.
And the whole process of courtship is kind of exhausting him, that he thinks, oh, I've done enough courting, and more courting is not necessary. I want to get it over with, So that thing is there at the back of the mind of the poet.
The desperate love.
The desperation. But you see, this is just to show, that the metaphysical poets were not just, abstract and spiritual. Sometimes they are very sensuous, very sensual, very rooted in common life situations. That in that sense, they are very contemporary poets. As this poem illustrates.
But who believed in breaking the routine and the
mundane and the commonplace, So they broke the ordinary barriers and they came up with something extraordinary, So in that sense, they are different or they are unique, Because they use this common life, but merely to achieve something greater. Because even this, the way the poem goes, though we cannot make our sun stand still, it ends this way. Yet we will make him run. So somehow time is meaningful with experience. Therefore, we have to make time meaningful in that sense, by living it, by living life. So the idea is, what I'm trying to say is that you see that they are not poets who are disconnected from reality. They are very much rooted in social reality, political reality, what is happening around them. So in that sense, their appeal to contemporary age is very, very distinct, is very, very evident.
They're very argumentative, very logical.
Right.
They're breaking a lot of mundane things, and
right.
Apart from all that, there is an element of cynicism also, which the metaphysical poets are often accused of, because they look at the so-called darker things of life, like lack of time or death. So.
But ironic,
cynicism,
I would say,
yeah.
but ironic more than cynical, you see. But I think they are more ironic in that sense. Because we cannot take their seriousness at face value. We have to realize that this is a poet who is playing with words. Look, all poetry is a play on language. So in that sense, they are playing with certain thoughts and certain views of reality. I hope that you have developed some taste and some appreciation for metaphysical poetry, what metaphysical poetry is all about.
Thank you so much, Prakash, for being here today and for making it look so easy. Thank you, participants.
Thank you very much.